Good morning, and welcome to this Fisher-Schultz Lecture, named in the honor of two great names in the history of economics and statistics, Irving Fisher and Henry Schultz. This current lecture will be given by a great economist of today, Costas Meghir from Yale University. Costas has covered many important fields in his research. He has written highly important papers in the area of labor economics, family economics, trade, development, and also early childhood development, to mention some of the areas. Costas has friends and co-authors around the world, and he has a publication list that looks more like a book than a list of publication, actually. Today, he's going to talk about trade and informality in the presence of labor market frictions and regulations. Please, Costas, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I'm deeply honored to be asked to give this lecture. It's, of course, I'm following some very important other people here, so being asked to give this talk is clearly a great honor. It's kind of interesting as well that the lecture is dedicated to Fisher and Schultz, so I'm sure in the future it might even lead to some debate about the name, given that Fisher was one of the greatest economists and at the same time a eugenicist as well. And of course Schultz is one of the people who have been at the foundation of empirical economics. So it's a very interesting set of people to name the lecture. Before I start, I'd like to thank the organizer of the conference for a wonderful meeting. It's been a huge relief to be able to come and talk to an in-person conference after such a long time being isolated in front of a Zoom screen and talking to pixels. So you know, if it wasn't for this terrible war, it would have been a moment of great rejoicing. But I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful to be interacting with people. I'm grateful to being able to have face-to-face conversations, which is one has used to be commonplace, but now has become a special treat. Anyway, let's go to the subject. I've been first of all, let me acknowledge that this is this lecture is drawn from material in the same paper authored by Rafael Dix-Carneiro, Penny Goldberg, myself, and Gabriel Ulyssea. Now, informality is a topic that has been interesting me for some time because it is so pervasive. And you find informality, of course, in developing countries. You find it in basically all advanced industrialized countries. You find it in countries also like Greece. And at some point you wonder exactly, you know, what the effect of having such an informal sector is, and ultimately, you know, what should be the policies to deal with it. So let me give you some idea. Informality represents a substantial share of the labor force in Latin America, and I'm talking about Latin America, but that's where the data is going to come from, Brazil. In South America, it's kind of 35% in Chile, which is, you know, one of the most advanced countries, and it reaches the levels of 80% in places like Peru. And now, what is informality? Well, of course, it's got two sides to it. It's got the firm side and the worker side. On the one hand, firms that are informal evade taxes. They do not pay social contributions. there are, they evade labor market regulations in more ways than one, but, of course, they don't necessarily adhere to minimum wage laws, but there are also other aspects that we don't necessarily capture in the models. I think there's a bit of an echo with, is it my idea? Perhaps like this is better. Of course, they ignore firing restrictions. And on the other hand, informal workers, from their side, they are not covered by various benefits. So, for example, they are not, they don't enjoy, say, being paid a minimum wage. They don't get health insurance often, or they get a very basic health insurance. They do not participate in pension schemes. So one of the key things, for example, that blew up the Chilean pension scheme is that a large proportion of workers spent a large proportion of their lifetime being informal workers, so they did not accumulate in the defined contribution pension scheme. They did not accumulate any benefits, and this, of course, created huge political issues that were reflected in the recent events there. So it's a kind of a big social problem. Now, within this context, there are alternative views to what informality is and what role it plays. So you could think of it as I could call it the Chicago view, where basically you've got all these regulations, and then you've got the informal sector. It gives you the competitive fringe. It undermines the sclerotic regulations and kind of corrects a distortion in some sense. That's one view. The other view, of course, is that it undermines basic institutions designed to improve work standards, allow tax collection, and permit the provision of public goods. Of course, the reality is that both elements are true. So in a world with frictions and informality, we have, there are both efficiency and distributional effects. Frictions and, in a world with frictions, it's a kind of a second best world, and there are both efficiency and distributional effects. And so I've worked on informality as a kind of a labor problem in a closed economy, and there are a bunch of interesting results there. But in a world with frictions, but now we're going to introduce informality to an open economy, and we're going to ask, how does the economy adapt to trade openness in the face of informality. So, as I said, it's pervasive. And the other thing that's very important to see is that the labor market is not really segmented in the sense that you get workers who transit between the formal and the informal sector, right? So it's not true that you've got just a group of people all engaged in the informal sector and then everybody in the formal sector. It's kind of I've just been wondering, how do I, okay, I'll come to, how do you skip to, yes, with a clicker it's going to be difficult, but anyway. So the broad question is, how does the presence of informality affect the impact of trade openness? The context is the following. A number of developing countries, and in our example, Brazil, opened up their economy to trade. How did they do that? They did it in two ways. First of all, they reduced tariffs quite a lot, quite massively, but then they reduced non-tariff barriers to trade. And this led them to a particular adjustment, and this has been examined. I would give you some results. You've got the work by McKaig and Pavnik. We've got the work by Dix-Carneiro and Kovac that are looking at how informality interacts with trade openness. And what Dix-Carneiro and Kovac show is that the presence of a large informal sector acted as a buffer to trade displaced workers. The point here is that when you open up the economy to trade, you increase competition for domestic firms. And as you increase competition for domestic firms, you tend to displace workers. Well, what happens is that the informal sector actually acts as a buffer to unemployment. And then there is other work by Ponczek and Ulyssea that shows that the way that trade openness affects the economy depends on how stringent the labor market regulations are, which of course translates to saying, how important is it, how different is the informal sector to the formal sector in terms of its ability to employ workers. So we revisit all these questions and the impact of trade liberalization on productivity, inequality, and welfare. And what I'm going to show you today is that many results that have been considered as accepted and commonplace on the effects of trade in an economy actually get reversed once you allow for the informal sector. So it's not just a small detail. So I will highlight now and I will show you later. For example, there's this view that trade openness increases inequality, where we will actually show you that once you take into account of the informal sector, you get that trade decreases inequality. So how have people been looking at the effect of trade on inequality? They've been using different diffs. The key idea is that when you have kind of relatively large economies like Brazil, large and also geographically segmented, some parts of Brazil are more exposed to trade than others, depending on the extent of tradable industry within each sector. So this has allowed different diffs type analysis of how trade openness has affected various dimensions like employment, earnings, and informality itself. Of course, what's going to happen here is that you're going to have very important general equilibrium feedback effects. So if you want to look at the overall impact, you have to move towards general equilibrium. And that's an important theme here, because while you can look at short-run impacts on certain aspects of the economy using simple quasi-experimental variation, when it comes to understanding in a deeper way how all these sectors of the economy interact and how the impacts are distributed, then you need to understand how all these sectors are linked to each other, which is one important aspect of our model, and how the results of something like a trade openness eventually feed through into the economy. So with our model, which I'm going to present in a little while, we were able to look at aggregate effects in the sense of comparing steady states. We're going to be able to look at distributional effects. We're going to be able to carry out counterfactual analysis and ask what's going to happen if we increase further trade openness. And importantly, we'll be able to do welfare analysis. There'll be a lot of things we will not be able to do because of the limitations of the model, like, for example, what's the distribution between different skill groups, like low and high education, which of course is a very important aspect. But of course, there's so much you can do on one step. Perhaps what I'm trying to say here is that this is also a research agenda where many of us will and should be working on, because there is a lot more questions to answer. Okay, so in terms of the literature, very, very briefly, we bring together kind of two literatures. One is the literature on informality, right, which is Jean-Marc Robin, Renata Narita, and myself have a paper. Gabriel Ulyssea has a very important paper there. And of course, you've got the well-known paper by Laporta and Schleifer, who described informality in many different countries. And on the other side, you've got the trade papers. And we draw very closely from the well-known paper by Kossar, Gunner, and Thibault and of course, all these models are influenced by the work by Melitz, and of course, Helpman, Ichocki, and Redding are important precursors in the kind of things we do. And then there are a number of papers that have been more on the quasi-experimental side, like Penny Goldberg and Nina Pavnik, McKagan Pavnik, and Dix-Carneiro and Kovac, which are at the heart of what we do. So there are various, we have to define what we mean by informality. And for firms, informal firms are those that do not register with the tax authorities and are invisible to the government. Informal workers are people who don't have formal contracts. And the nice thing is that in Brazil, there's a very good definition, which can be verified by the surveyor. When they are asked where they work, they are asked to show a particular worker card. And if that's not stamped by the firm in which they work, that means they're informal. It's not that straightforward in all contexts, but at least in Brazil, where we're working, the definition of informality for a worker is very clear. One thing about firms I'd like to say, something that we don't do, is that as Gabriel Ulyssea showed, some formal firms actually hire informal workers as well. So, you walk into this kind of small manufacturing firm, there'll be, let's say, 10 workers who are formal and 1 or 2 who are informal. Now that we don't, it's an important margin, by the way, but it's of course quite difficult to deal with in the kind of our model, and we don't. And it's been discussed by Gabriel in his paper. Now, the consequence of informality is, first of all, you have tax evasion, which of course hinders the provision of public goods. You've got misallocation of resources. Now, that's an important dimension here that matters a lot. Think of an economy with frictions, and think of workers randomly looking for jobs. They find a job that's kind of suitable, but it's informal, and they stop searching there. And if that informal firm did not exist, then search would continue, and they'd be reallocated to higher productivity firms. And that's going to be a very important margin for explaining many of the effects that we see. So there's this misallocation of resources in this frictional world. Okay, so what's our approach? We develop an equilibrium model that builds on Cossard, Gunner, and Thibault, and the earlier work on informality. And the model has the following features. It's got heterogeneous firms, like in Melitz. They choose endogenously to operate in the formal or the informal sector. In the formal sector, they have to abide by regulations. What does that mean? They have to pay taxes, they have to pay minimum wages, they have to respect firing costs, and so on. If they are informal, they will have to pay fines if they are caught, and these fines can be substantial. The model has search and matching frictions. So the labor market is frictional, so people search for jobs and it takes them some time to find one. And we allow for quite a rich institutional setting. So we have, as I said, minimum wages, we have official firing costs, we have payroll and value-added taxes, and we have import tariffs. And this is all very important if you want to characterize the difference for a firm being formal vis-à-vis informal. Of course, all these regulations are imperfectly enforced, which allows the opportunity for a firm to be informal. And what's going to happen in the model is that smaller firms are going to be less visible to the government than larger firms. So as you become larger and larger, you become more and more visible, and the probability of being caught increases, which of course increases the cost of informality, which gives you the incentive to a greater incentive to formalize. And then, of course, the model will include international trade. I guess that's the point. And it imports affect all firms in the economy through aggregate demand. Now that's the important point here about general equilibrium, is that production will use intermediate goods. There are going to be two sectors in production. There's going to be the manufacturing and services sector. Both are going to use intermediate goods. What does that mean? It means that as firms compete from outside, that affects the cost of intermediates and consequently affects both the non-tradable and the tradable sector. So there's a channel whereby trade openness affects all aspects of the economy, right? And that's why, unless you look at the really immediate aftermath of a trade liberalization episode, a quasi-experimental approach is going to be, is going to be difficult to justify, or in any case to pick up the entire size of the effect. Okay, so, and by the way, there are one important element, as in Mellitz, we have fixed costs of exporting. So if a firm wants to become an exporter, they have to basically expend a substantial amount of money, and that means, of course, that the exporters will be the more productive firms. To do all this, we had to combine a number of data sets. Now, in Brazil has just an amazing data. And there are the two key data sets here are RICE, which is used by really many people, and that's the formal sector matched employer-employee data. So basically, you've got all formal sector firms and workers, right? And they are all you can see all of them. But then they also have, not continuously, but they've got an informality survey where it's all firms up to 5 employees. Most informal firms are not much larger than that. They're actually, most informal firms are below that. So you've got data both on informal firms and data on formal firms, right? On top of that, you've got these 3 data sets, PIA, PAS, and PAC, that have basically it's a census of all firms above 20 employees, and a random survey for firms below these thresholds. And from this data, you get details on revenues, inputs, investments, and so on, because that's not in the matched employer-employee data. So you get all this kind of balance sheet data. So that's very important. We need revenues, for example, to identify substitution elasticity and so on, and much else. And then you've got the household survey, which is a kind of a CPS type data set, where basically you're able to see the workers and how much they earn, and whether they're formal or informal. That's where you see if the contract exists and if the labor card has been stamped. We exclude the public and the primary sector, and we include the self-employed as one worker firms. So all the self-employed are in the model as one-person firms. So this, when I was mumbling before, I was suddenly anticipating this slide, because suddenly I realized that I can't just press fact 1 and take you to where I wanted to go, but I think I'll try and do it in a more manual way, like going to the end of the slides. So these are 5 facts. Why are we listing this? Because a good model has to satisfy these, has to be able to explain these 5 facts if it's going to do a credible job in answering the questions that we have posed. So Brazil has a large informal sector. Half of employment is informal. And transitions from unemployment to informal are more than twice as likely than transitions from unemployment to formal. Now that's very important. Why? Because suppose you've got this shock, right? And you get people displaced from the formal sector, they become unemployed, they are much more likely to end up in the informal sector, right? So that's one of the key mechanisms by which the external shocks are going to matter. Okay, so let me try this. So the probability that the firm is informal declines sharply with its employment size. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to mention fact 3 as well, and then actually I'll go to the data and show it to you. The other, fact 3 is actually really important and interesting, and that's something that up to relatively recently had not been noticed. Okay, first of all, informal firms are on average less productive than formal firms. Okay, we know that from Laporte and Schleifer. But what is fascinating here is that the distribution of productivities of formal and informal firms overlap, right? So, and that really points you to a frictional type model. In other words, you pick a productivity, and more or less at any productivity, there's a proportion of firms that are formal and firms that are not informal. Now, to the risk of messing everything up, I will try and show you this. Okay, so first of all, what I mentioned before, that informality status, right, is declines very, very rapidly with firm size, right? So you see a huge impact. This is the tradable sector, this is the services sector, non-tradable. So you can see this huge impact of employment on whether, so, and this is what I was telling you before, when you become large, you become much more visible. Then we have that productivity measured as revenue per worker, conditional on size, is first of all much higher for the formal firms, these are formal firms, relative to the informal firms. Right? So these are substantially larger productivity at every level of employment. Exporters are much more productive than non-exporting firms. We explain that with this fixed cost of becoming an exporter. And formal firms pay much better than informal firms. So all these are facts that we need to have the model explain. And this is what I was telling you from the overlap of productivities, right? So the red curve is the productivity distribution of informal firms. The blue dotted curve is the productivity of the formal firms. And two things, the red's to the left of the blue, that's lower productivity as I just showed you. But there's this huge overlap, right, which points against any strict market segmentation and more towards these kind of frictional models that we're discussing. Okay, so that's a very arcane way to work slides in the modern era, but there you are. Okay. And finally, you see another very important fact, which is going to really be at the heart of the explanations of the model. So this is the turnover of workers. Now, what do you see here? You see two things in both the tradable and the non-tradable sector. You see that larger firms have lower turnover. So we need to explain that, right? But you also see that exporters have higher turnover, right? And this is what in the literature has been called the distribution effect, and exporter impact is what's called the sensitivity effect. And what's going to happen there, and we're going to introduce that in our model, is that the exporters who have a bigger market are more sensitive to productivity shocks. And consequently, this, given everything else, a productivity shock has a bigger impact on exporters. A demand shock has a bigger impact on exporters, and they shed more labor. Right, so that's a very important mechanism. Coming back to that. Okay, so let's go to the model. Obviously, it's got many standard things. So you've got consumers have a kind of homothetic utility function in tradables and non-tradables, right? And so what does that mean? It means that our model, in our model, the size of the tradable and the non-tradable sector are kind of fixed, exogenous from this preference parameter because of homotheticity, but I just wanted to put that aside. And the tradable commodity consists of an aggregation of all sorts of varieties. Now, some people say, well, you know, why do you want to introduce this complication in the model? Actually, it's an important complication, because what happens is that the informal firms come in at on average at the left side of the distribution, and they increase the set of varieties that are available in the economy. So this has a welfare effect in itself, right? And we can capture that with this. And of course, non-tradable is the same thing. Now, this is the production function. It's Cobb-Douglas in labor and intermediates. Intermediates are produced by tradables and non-tradables, right? And so that's going to be an important channel through which the external trade shocks are going to affect both the tradable sector and the non-tradable sector. Now, this is the heterogeneity. So, if you like, this is TFP, and TFP evolves as a stochastic process. So, not only are firms heterogeneous, but they are subject to shocks. And by the way, just to anticipate, this rho is basically 1. So this is really a random walk. Although we don't impose that, that comes out in the data. So let me give you the timing of the model, which hopefully will help you understand what's going on. So for the moment, we're ignoring the exporters. We're going to introduce them a little. We're going to introduce the open economy element in a few minutes. So we have a firm. These are incumbents. It's got a particular value. It's informal. That's I for informal. So at that point, it either exits or stays informal or becomes formal. That's the choices. Once it decides what kind of firm it is, it chooses employment. This generates a flow of profits. It draws a new productivity, and so on. Formal firms cannot become informal. Formal firms can either continue operating or they close down. Right? You can't go to the authorities and say, sorry, I've decided, changed my mind, I'm deregistering. So they have to go through non-existence, and otherwise it's the same kind of thing. Now, of course, this is a model with free entry, so you want to ask what happens at the entry point. So entrants pay a fixed cost. This is the C there, and then they get their initial productivity, and they either immediately exit or they endogenously choose to be formal or informal. And they start with one worker, right? And then they decide where they're going to. So that's the timing of the model. Now, we have to, in order to get an insight as to how these firms operate, we need to understand how their profits are generated. Well, that's not, so the VA means value added, so that's nice and straightforward. Formal firms have to pay a tax, right, TY, on value added. And then they incur costs. Now, these costs here are effectively, wage costs and hiring costs for firms that hire, and wage costs plus firing costs for firms that are contracting. Okay, so this bit here is whatever it costs you to increase your labor force from L to L prime. And one important feature is that this cost involves you buying non-tradable goods. Okay, so that's another linkage in the economy. So when you grow, so you've got this firm, let's say it becomes an exporter, it grows. What does that do? It increases the demand in the non-tradable sector. Right? So that's yet another linkage, which is very important. This bit here is the regulatory firing cost. Right? So this firing cost is it goes into the government coffers. So when a firm fires workers, it has to pay the government, right? And that goes towards funding taxes and so on. So basically, the bottom line is that expanding firms pay hiring costs that reflect frictions, and contracting firms pay firing costs reflecting regulations. And that's why we talk both about frictions and regulations. Informal firms are basically simpler. They also have to pay hiring costs, right? They work in the same frictional labor market. It's possibly a different hiring cost, but it's still there. But when they fire, they do not have to pay anything to the government. So that's why their costs when they're contracting people, it's just the wage bill. It's the wage times employment. They don't have to pay minimum wages. Of course, they have to respect the reservation wages, otherwise they're not going to hire anybody. But if reservation wages are below minimum wages, that's fine. And occasionally they get caught. So you've got this cost of informality. It's proportional to revenue. So the bigger the firm, the bigger the fine. And also we estimate that, but it's convex in the size of the firm, right? So bigger firms are more likely to be caught, right? And consequently, this reflects this in this growing K. Okay, so contrary to my beliefs, I'm slightly slowly running out of time. So now, of course, what monopolistic competition means is that you've got this term here, right? And this term is a demand shifter, and it depends on prices of tradables and non-tradables, because we're pricing out intermediaries, and it depends also on aggregate income, right? So that's an endogenous object here. Okay, and this is the productivity, and this is the employment bit. Now, firing costs, I need to explain this because actually it's the structure of this function is very important to understand the model. So hiring costs, first of all, depends on how big a step you want to make. If you want to hire another 5 workers or another 10 workers, it's going to change the costs. And how rapidly the costs grow depends on this parameter here, and this is going to be it's going to be above 1. So you're going to have you're going to have convex hiring costs, right? Now, then this thing here controls the difference in the growth rates as the firm size goes up. Now, what this structure of the hiring cost achieves is 2 things. First of all, it changes the turnover depending on the size of the firm. Because remember, if you go back to the 70s and 80s when people were talking about adjustment costs, right? These are the adjustment costs that we were talking about, and they induce persistence in employment, right? Because of these anticipated firing costs, firms hoard labor or sometimes hold back from hiring labor. And the point is that depending on the parameter values, the persistence of employment within the firm will be different for small firms and large firms. So this is how we're going to generate the fact that the large firms have lower turnover is by the parameters here. The other thing that this is going to do is actually going to introduce wage dispersion between firms, right? Because firms effectively set the marginal value to the cost of an additional worker, right? With convex hiring costs, basically you're going to have that, that larger firms are going to be paying higher wages, which is of course true in the data, right? And that's going to generate wage dispersion. So that's why I'm saying that this hiring cost function and its structure is is extremely important in generating many of the, in being able to replicate many of the facts that I mentioned before that we find in the data. So, how do firms hire? Well, there's a search and matching technology, and basically workers search randomly. You could think of another model where firms, we've got some kind of directed search. We don't have directed search here, we have random search. And wages are determined once, well, the way we think about it is that there's a union, there's a firm level union, and in every period, so there's no persistence in the wage in that sense, in every period the firm and the union bargain and in a Nash bargaining kind of fashion, this determines wages. And okay, search frictions of course means that firms can underpay, but that's, so here's the matching function. You've got vacancies, you've got the number of unemployed people. There's no on-the-job search in this paper, right? So all search happens while people are unemployed. And vacancies, we take vacancies to be the sum of all vacancies in the formal and the informal sector, right? And then basically the matches in each sector are proportional to their contribution to the vacancy pool. So for example, if the formal non-tradable sector has many more vacancies, they'll have many more matches in a proportional fashion. Okay, this is all totally standard. Okay, so now we open up the economy. So a lot of what we said up to now is basically very similar to forget about that. So now we're going to introduce the open economy. So there's going to be an export decision here. If the value of exporting minus the fixed cost of becoming an exporter is larger than the value of being just a domestic firm, you export. Otherwise, you don't, right? And I've already stressed enough that the transmission of trade shocks to the services and the informal sector goes through the intermediate inputs. Now, this is a pretty important point here. So think of this as being the value added for domestic firms, right? Then, okay, so you've got the demand shifters there. That's the aggregate income in the economy enters there, price of intermediates and everything. Exporters have the same structure of value added multiplied by this extra component here, which reflects the fact that they are facing a larger market because they are selling abroad to foreign markets. This thing here in red is greater than 1. What does that mean? It means that the variance of value added for exporting firms is going to be higher than the variance of value added for importing firms at any given employment size. And that's where the effect of turnover is going to come for exporting firms. Now, wage setting. So there's basically a firm surplus. A firm surplus is basically value added minus what it has to pay its workers plus the future value. Workers have a value of remaining in the job minus the unemployment value. We don't have to go into any great detail. This is multiplied by the size of the workforce because, as I said, this is the surplus of the union. That's bargaining for wages. So they just, and we assume basically symmetric bargaining. So we set the bargaining power to 50%. We can't identify from the data. So this determines what wages are going to be. Basically, the surplus of the union is basically 50% of the total surplus. Okay, so these are the demand functions. They are pretty standard, because of homotheticity and so on. Just to point out here that the foreign demand for domestically produced goods is kind of exogenously given with this demand shifter and depends on the same kind of prices. The important point here is the domestic demand for foreign produced goods depends on three things: well, the exchange rate, the tariffs, and the iceberg costs. So these two parameters here reflect the cost of trade. So if these become smaller, then you get more trade openness. Okay, so equilibrium is quite standard. Labor market's clear, good market's clear. There's free entry, and so on. Everybody optimizes. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanisms. I've hinted at them already, but let's just summarize it. First of all, domestic firms in the tradable sector face greater competition as a result of an opening up to trade. So, what happens is you open up the economy to trade, and you have a decline in the demand for domestically produced goods. So low productivity formal firms are replaced by informal firms. Okay, you open up the economy, so you get that margin more informality. On the other hand, you've got the closure of the least productive informal firms because they are facing more competition as well. That goes in the other way. Then you have a decline in formal employment, right? Basically because the people displaced from the closure of some formal firms become unemployed, right? And then because it's easier to find a job in the informal sector, right? Then you've got an increase in informality on that side. Then you've got a decline in the price of intermediaries. So that affects all firms positively because they all use intermediaries. Okay, so that increases formalization, but also allows for entry of informal firms. Okay, so there are all these counteracting mechanisms that are at play when we look at the results. Now, there is, on the other hand, an external balance. That means that imports have to equal exports. What does that mean? It implies an increase in demand for exports from our economy. And the lower cost of intermediaries also promotes exports because it makes domestic production cheaper. So exporting firms will grow. And labor will be reallocated to exporting firms. Now, exporting firms are larger, that means lower turnover, but exporting firms are also more sensitive to shocks, that means higher turnover. Sorry, the world is complicated. And that's partly the point of this talk, that if you want to look at these kinds of policies, you have to take into account these linkages. Now, lower trade barriers will increase the proportion of exporting firms. Okay. So how do we estimate this model? It's quite a complex model to estimate. Basically, we use indirect inference. And we have 27 parameters. We have 84 data moments. I gave you an idea of what the moments are. So when I was showing you the impact, say, of firm size on productivity, that's one of the moments we're going to fit, right? When I was showing you the effect of firm size on whether you're informal or not, that's another moment. So basically what we'll be doing is we'll be simulating the model, right, generating simulated data, and then we'll be regressing a bunch of outcomes on a bunch of variables like employment and so on, and we will require that the estimated coefficients from the simulated data equal the estimated coefficients from the actual data. That's the process. That's originally, well, it's basically a method of moments estimator, but a la McFadden and Pecos and so on, and written in terms of indirect inference by Guerrero, Montfort, and Renault. Okay, so let me just try and give you a little bit of an idea before I tell you the results of what identifies what, which is kind of important. First of all, we have the elasticity of substitution between goods, all right, between varieties in some sense. Okay, that's informed by the relationship between value added and firm size. Okay, that's the first factor here. Then the scaling of the hiring costs, right, is identified by average turnover rates and the unemployment rate. And the scale economies for hiring is identified by the auxiliary model relating turnover to employment levels and export status. The relationship of log wages to log employment, right, informs the convexity of hiring costs. I already justified that. The fixed cost of production is identified by the way exit rates vary with firm size. So we see firms exiting, and that helps us identify the fixed cost of production. And we see the size of firms which exit, right? The cost of informality is identified by the distribution of the firm size distribution of informal firms that we see in one of our data sets. And the fixed cost of exporting is easy, is identified by the proportion of firms exporting. A lot of numbers here, but ignore them. Just look at the blue ones. These are preset parameters that we cannot identify in this paper that we take from other papers. So for example, the trade openness is called iceberg costs here, is 2.5. This is a large number, but that's what you need. It means that in order to send one unit of a good to another economy, you need to ship 2.5 units, right? And that reflects the trade barriers. Reducing the iceberg costs is what we call increasing trade openness. And then you have the firing costs that comes from the detailed analysis by Heckman and Pagues and the minimum wage. Okay, and then everything else is kind of straightforward. Okay, so these are estimated parameters. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time because I want to take you through the counterfactuals. We have the hiring cost convexity is very high for both, even higher in the non-tradable sector. Right? The cost of informality is much higher in the convexity of informality is much higher in the tradable sector than non-tradable. And the productivity shocks are basically almost a random walk. Okay, and that's the elasticity substitution for varieties. Okay, so now we're going to look at counterfactuals that basically get at the ideas we were talking about before. How are we going to do this? We're going to take the model and we're going to simulate it at baseline and at different levels of trade openness. Now, we're not going to vary tariffs because tariffs actually are quite low and form only a very small proportion of the costs of trading. In other words, most of the barriers to trades are non-tariff barriers, particularly in Brazil at that time. Okay, the tariff was about 12%. So we're going to take the iceberg costs, and we have a baseline which is 2.5, and we're going to vary it to as low as 1.5. That would be a lot of trade openness, and as high as 6, which is basically autarky, basically shutting down almost all exports. Okay, so here we come to the meat of the matter. This thing here, first of all, you have to read from right to left. The baseline is here, 2.5 iceberg costs. Trade openness is travel from here leftward, and autarky is travel from here rightward. This is the share of tradable informal workers. Now, what do you see here? As you open up to trade, the share of informal workers declines in the tradable sector. Now, what's happening there? On the one hand, you've got increased competition for everybody, right? In the tradable sector, and what that does, it basically closes down and makes informal a number of firms that used to be formal. That should increase informality. But there's another effect. The lower productivity informal firms are finding it much harder to compete now, and they are closing down. So while there is a pressure on the formal firms to become informal via closing down and re-entering, there's also a lot of pressure on the low productivity informal firms that close down. So the net composition effect of this is to actually reduce informal employment. Then look at the non-tradable sector. The opposite is happening there. Why? Well, as I'll show you, trade openness actually increases incomes. It makes the economy much wealthier. And what does that mean? It means an increase in demand for non-tradables. As the demand for non-tradable increases, this kind of lifts all the ships. On the one hand, the more efficient non-tradable firms become formal. That should be a reduction in informality. But you've got a lot of entry at the bottom end as well. Firms that couldn't operate before now start operating. And the net effect is actually an increase in informality. But if you look overall at what happens, now the other thing you have to remember is that in terms of employment at least, the non-tradable sector is larger than the tradable sector. Right? So there's an issue of weights there as well. Eventually, if you put all this together in all sectors, for a relatively small changes in relatively small increase in openness, you've got an increase in the share of informal employment, but then that eventually decreases because both this, which looks small, but for a large part of the economy, and this are going down. So eventually, if you go from very relatively large trade barriers to quite an open economy, you basically have no effect on informality. Okay. Well, first of all, let's actually look at real income, which is kind of important because that's going to be our measure of welfare, right? There's an unambiguous result that as you open up the economy, real income goes up. In other words, tradables, opening up to trade improves the aggregate welfare in the economy, unambiguously. That's always going to be the case. But this is not going to be necessarily true for unemployment. And this is because of what I was saying before. So basically what's going to happen here, as you, as you reallocate firms to, as you reallocate workers to larger firms when you're opening up the economy, on the one hand, the fact these firms are larger will lead to less turnover and consequently less unemployment. But then you've got this sensitivity effect, this Meghir sensitivity effect, that these exporting firms are actually much more sensitive to these productivity shocks, and this kind of dominates, right, and leads to increases in unemployment. Right. And I should say there that the growth of firms in the non-tradable sector mitigates the increase in unemployment, right? Because it's this thing here. This thing here mitigates the increase in unemployment. Now, this is highlights the importance of allowing for the informal sector. The blue line shows you productivity as you open up the economy in the tradable sector. Right? Now, exactly because you're opening up the economy in the tradable sector, you encourage exports, so exporting firms become larger, right? And they are more productive, right? So that increases average productivity. But it doesn't seem to do a lot. However, when you take into account the informal sector, the increase in productivity is much larger. And what's happening there, of course, is a kind of a obviously it's a composition effect. What's happening is that opening up to trade closes down the least productive informal firms and leaves the right part of the distribution intact. So basically, opening up to trade reallocates resources overall to more productive, both informal and formal firms. And when you put the two together, the increase in productivity overall is much higher. Okay, that's another thing that distinguishes this paper from earlier results. Of course, when you look at the non-tradable sector, well, it doesn't look the same at all, exactly because, as I showed you, the increase in trade actually allows the entrance of a lot of low productivity, informal, non-tradable firms. So while you have quite a high increase in productivity among the formal non-tradable firms, right, which are actually providing services to the new firms that are opening as well, once you take into account the informal sector, this is muted for the simple reason that opening up the economy increases the demand for all these non-tradables and allows the low productivity non-tradables to low productivity non-tradable firms to enter. Now this is I just think this is quite amazing. So first of all, here you have the conventional wisdom. Right? What's happening here? This is the variance of wages, and this is the benchmark. You open up the economy, and you increase wage dispersion. You increase wage inequality. Why is this happening? Well, it's happening because you've got now larger exporting firms. The larger exporting firms increase in size and number, right? And they pay more. So the workers that are reallocated there get much higher wages, and this increases the dispersion of wages. And this is the result that's actually known in the literature that says trade increases inequality. But it's only really one part of the story. All these economies we talk about have very large informal sectors. It doesn't really make sense to ignore that. So let's see what happens in the informal tradable sector. Well, we see that wage dispersion declines. For the same reason I've been saying before, what's going on here is that you're trimming the left tail of informal firms. They become more concentrated around higher productivity just before many of them want to become formal, and that compresses the wage. So this is a kind of a within effect, another within effect. You put the two together, and you have a decline in overall wage dispersion in the tradable sector. Now let's see what happens in the non-tradable sector. Well, that's kind of interesting. You might think, oh, there's a mistake there. No, there is no mistake. What's going on here is that within the formal firms and within the informal firms, you've got an increase in dispersion, and that's happening because you've got entry and an increase in demand, and they are growing. So you've got greater dispersion of productivity. But then there's another effect. There's the between effect, right? So the informal sector firms and the formal sector firms converge in size. Somehow they become closer in size, and the net effect is that overall dispersion declines. So here we are. Trade reduces inequality. Trade openness reduces inequality, at least in the context of an economy like Brazil. It does not increase it, right? And that's, of course, a very important result, particularly if you think of all the debates we've been having about globalization and its impact on not only aggregate welfare, but of course distribution, which is very much in the mind of a lot of people. I mean, okay, so I'm not sure how much. This is just saying the same thing. All I just wanted to point out is that if you do, a within-between kind of thing, let's take the manufacturing sector. In the manufacturing sector, you have that so the within term increases, all right? But the between term decreases, right? So, okay, that's fine. Finally, let's look at the effects of increasing the cost of informality. So another kind of policy you could go with, or not an alternative, perhaps both, would be to just reduce informality and see what happens. So first of all, perhaps I should just compare the benchmark with no informality, because we don't have too much time. The unemployment rate goes up. If you remove informality, the unemployment rate just goes up, nearly doubles. Welfare goes down. Okay. Now there's a kind of an interesting effect there, because one of the reasons that welfare goes down is because when you close down the informal sector, you reduce also the number of varieties available in the market. So, and in this model, and I guess in reality, consumers have a taste for variety, right? And in this model, each firm produces a different variety. If you close down a bunch of firms, then you reduce varieties and you reduce welfare. It's extremely difficult to abstract from this effect, from the other effects, right? But I'm just wanting to say that part of what's going on is this reduction in variety. So where does this leave us? Well, let's look at a final thing here. Here we're looking at what would happen, the role of the informal sector in accommodating productivity shocks. So, suppose you've got a benchmark. You've got here I've got a share of informal employment, unemployment rate, and welfare. And I have three alternatives. The benchmark, as the Brazilian economy is now, stricter enforcement, that's basically increasing a little bit the convexity of informality costs, and no informality at all. So, if you have and we throw a negative productivity shock, all right? So if in the benchmark economy, what happens with the negative productivity shock, informality goes up, and unemployment rate actually goes down. And of course, welfare goes down. Negative productivity shocks are bad, so the model is not crazy, okay? Now, suppose you move to an economy where you either have stricter enforcement or no informality at all. In this case, you've got an increase in unemployment rate, right? And of course, a decline in welfare. So what's going on here is that the informal sector acts as a buffer to employment in the face of negative productivity shocks, right? And stricter enforcement, all it will do is would increase unemployment rate, but it doesn't act as a welfare buffer, okay? Because there's a contraction in the overall economy. Okay, so basically, when you open up the economy to trade, you end up having you do end up having more unemployment, but at the same time you get improved welfare, right? And improved productivity. If you increase enforcement, then you know, and in some sense you don't really affect informality. If you clamp down on informality without other changes, then you remove an important buffer in the economy, right? And you don't protect it from welfare reductions really as a result of these external shocks. Now, of course, in order to think about all this, you have to think of the context, right? So, you know, informality has its downsides. You know, it's kind of important to realize that when you have an informal economy, it's harder to deliver social services, it's harder to implement anti-poverty programs, it's harder to provide proper pensions and so on. On the other hand, you know, we know that you know, even if we deregulate the economy, at some level we need some basic regulations, right? Because you know, well, I'm not going to justify this is obvious. I think you can't have a completely free-for-all economy. So you're always going to have you know, some informality there because there's always going to be an incentive. And I guess the point of this thing here is that you know, clamping down on that too much can be totally counterproductive. Returning to the trade side, this model shows quite clearly that trade is no villain, right? It increases welfare, it can reduce inequality, and but it does have side effects like increasing unemployment. So let me conclude. The informal economy is a major feature of developing and many developed countries. In many ways, it obstructs the implementation of labor market policy, taxation, and welfare assistance. The impacts of the informal sector can be more nuanced on the other hand. We investigate how informality affects the impact of trade liberalization based on an equilibrium trade model incorporating an informal sector. I would like to stress here that while it's very important to use quasi-experimental evidence to try and get at important causal impacts, eventually we need to put all this together within the context of a model if we're really going to get at the deeper questions of policy, right? You know, while looking at marginal effects is very useful to understand certain things about economics, ultimately many of the big questions relating to development, trade, and so on are questions relating to general equilibrium. So unfortunately, we cannot shy away from that, and we have to do it in as best a way we can. The model we have is consistent with empirical patterns based on quasi-experimental studies, so that is some kind of validation. Trade openness leads to declines in informality in the tradable sector. Informal sector acts as an employment buffer in face of negative shocks. Both of these results come from empirical analysis. So we offer new insights implied by the model. Trade openness leads to ambiguous effects in aggregate informality. Informal sector does not act as a welfare buffer in the face of negative shocks. Repressing informality increases productivity at the expense of welfare, whereas trade leads to the same productivity gains and increases welfare. Trade increases wage inequality in the formal tradable sector, but this effect is reversed when we include the informal sector in the analysis. The effect of trade on productivity is understated in the if the informal sector is left out, and there are large welfare gains from trade, robust to different scenarios in which informality is either completely or partially repressed. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Costas. So we're actually running over time a little bit, but let's open up for a few questions, if there are any. We have these mics, so please raise your hand and we'll come to you. Peter.
Thank you for a very nice talk. You were not very explicit about the time horizon of these impacts of trade openness. I guess there must be some dynamic adjustment with the frictional labor market here. Maybe you can comment on this.
Yeah, I'd love to be able to comment on that. These are really comparing alternative steady states. And I think your question is very important, not only because it's nice to know how quickly the economy will adjust from one steady state to the other, but I think that the welfare effects on the way from one steady state to the other are probably a very important feature, which also have, political implications, right? So, who are the losers, who are the gainers, and so that's unfortunately we don't deal with that at all. But not because it's not important, but because it's hard.
Thanks so much. This was a great talk. My question pertains to the nature of the informal sector. So when we think about informal sector, we usually think about the gray economy. But then there's the black economy, right? With some firms can be directly linked to the black markets, and they might not be necessarily profit maximizing in the standard definition, right? So I just wonder whether you have an idea about the relative share of the black economy and gray economy in this sector.
Well, I'm not sure exactly how to distinguish these. Perhaps Gabriel Ulyssea's idea of these firms who are formal but hire some informal workers is what you might call the gray economy. But if you want to visualize what these informal firms are, think of small garages or food trucks or small manufacturing little IT firms that will offer IT support so that's the best I can do, I'm afraid, in answering your question.
So let's have one last question now.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Fascinating talk. I'd like to continue on the informal sector, and then also from public finance perspective, that what would be the type of optimal fine structure and optimal employer contribution structure? So should there be some type of progressivity that you would have, let's say, smaller fines for smaller informal firms and then higher fines, and then you would have, should the employer contributions be also progressive in the framework of your
I think that's a really interesting question. What's the, in some sense, what's the optimal tax structure if you have informal firms? Ever since I started working on informality, which is too long, I've been in two minds, because people who are informal really don't get very important benefits, right? So, and governments are very hesitant to extend benefits like good health care and good pensions, because they don't want to, quote, incentivize the informal sector. So, thinking of policies that would, optimally, kind of have a more graduated tax system depending on size. But then again, these things have, have their adverse effects. If you think of the Van Reenen and I can't remember the other co-authors' paper on, the distortions of size-based regulations, that basically, it's a very hard second-best problem, where you're trading off one distortion against the other, and I think that would be a fantastic project for someone to think about with real data. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we should close here. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Costas, for a great talk.
Thank you.